Hi, I'm Ale. This is a lecture about international politics for APDA Summer Open. I'll start with sort of a brief introduction of what I'm going to talk about. The first is three foundational schools of thought in IR. The second is some canonical concepts in debating politics. And thirdly is how do you debate politics in APDA? I'll make two notes. The first is there will be some content, obviously, in this lecture, but I will try to dwell more on how it's usable in APTA rather than just trying to explain the nitty-gritty of each concept. I think you can get that more easily from Wikipedia or from a class. And so I hope to make it more directly applicable to the way you actually debate. The second thing is I use the term international politics. The reason why is because international relations describes relations between states, but a lot of what we debate about and call IR and APTA is actually just the domestic politics of a state that is not the US. And so I use international politics to try to encompass both of those fields. I'll start with some schools of thought. So the first one and the most frequent one in APTA is realism. There are several foundational assumptions of realism. The authors somewhat disagree with each other, but here are a few that I think are pretty foundational, generally speaking. The first is anarchy, which is to say that there is no policeman you can call in the world order. If someone attacks you, it is your state is that is your own responsibility, and you have to deal with it yourself. Now, obviously, there are alliances, etc., but there is no over supervising power that can regulate interactions between states. Secondly, is that intentions are uncertain. I could be lying about what I say, and I could change my mind about what I say. And so states fundamentally do not know that what the other states are saying or signaling is actually true. Thirdly, is that security comes first. States may have a multiplicity of goals, but they have to have their own security to be able to pursue all of their goals, and so they act accordingly. Fourthly, is that states are rational actors. Realist authors disagree quite a bit about what this means. They also disagree about when it applies, whether it is true or simply just an idea that makes realist theory more tractable. But what I mean by this is basically just states act in ways that they believe will advance their own security according to a rational theory. Now, those theories can be rational and still wrong, but they are still rational theories. So an example that Mearsheimer often gives for this is the US pursuing regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s was a rational theory. It was not a correct theory. It ended up being bad for our security, according to him, at the very least. But it was a rational theory because there was some evidence to support it. So death cults, for example, would not be a rational theory. There can be theories that are sort of in that in-between space. What are the outputs of realism? Firstly, is that security competition is inevitable and that relative gains matter most. Security competition does not just mean war. War is the most extreme form of security competition, but it can also just be quite a bit less than that. It can be arms races, it can be tit-for-tat tensions, etc. This is largely because if I don't know what other state is doing, I'm going to be scared of that state as a result because they could hurt me and because they care about their own security and they might think that I'm affected their security. Relative gains mattering is another term for this simple concept, which is to say that if I gain X, but a different state gains more than I did from a given interaction, then I have lost out because that state could use that extra gain against me. And so while I might think that me gaining X in the absolute is great, what matters a lot more is not what I gain in the absolute, is what I gain relative to the other states that were participating in that interaction. The second concept sort of derived from security competition is a security dilemma, which is basically this. I am scared of the other state. I think the other state might attack me. They say they won't, but I don't know if they're telling the truth. And if they do attack me, I'm kind of out of luck because I can't just call the police. It's kind of a self-help world. And so what I do is I arm myself. I say, I want to defend myself. I'm going to buy a bunch of guns. Now, I don't want to attack their state, but the other state sees me buy a bunch of guns and thinks, gee, well, they might attack me now. And certainly they have the capability of doing so. And so I'm going to arm myself. And so you end up getting into situations where neither state necessarily actually wants to do anything to the other, but you have escalation because states are uncertain of what the other one wants and therefore are forced to protect themselves in the self-help world that is the realist international system. What are the weaknesses of realism? I think there are three big ones. The first is domestic politics. Realism is a theory that says that the only difference between states in the international system is their power. International politics is a billiard game, and the only difference in it is the size of the balls. This is not really true. Domestic politics matter a ton, both because politicians care about it, obviously, because domestic politics govern what we consider to be security, what we consider to be the acceptable trade-offs between security and other objectives. And they also make it so intentions are not as uncertain. If another state just elected a certain leader who campaigned vigorously on the idea of I won't do X thing, then maybe they could do X thing. That's conceivably possible. There's still uncertainty. but I am considerably less likely as another state to assume that they will do X thing. And so domestic politics sort of mediate and mitigate each of the foundational assumptions that realism takes. The second is the resilience of organizations like NATO. A lot of realists expected that after the Cold War, NATO would basically fall into obsolescence because there would really be no reason for states to engage in this kind of organization that forfeits part of their own sovereignty in order to promote some kind of sort of vague third-party goal. And yet, states have remained reasonably committed to NATO, at least until pretty recently. And that's true for a lot of organizations. And that suggests that cooperation is quite a bit more possible than you would expect from just taking realist assumptions at their word. Lastly is that prosperity matters too. This matters in two ways. The first is that prosperity often augments security. And so what realists say is like, well, security always comes first before prosperity becomes a more complicated equation because you might concede that point, but also say that prosperity is the most important way of advancing security. And then you're kind of unclear as to what realism actually prescribes on that question. And secondly is that states don't just care about security because a lot of the time states feel pretty secure. And so they care more about other things in the immediate term. Like certainly the US, a lot of Western democracies, arguably China at this point don't really feel like there are significant existential threats to themselves. And so they might be willing to forfeit at least part of their immediate security if it does mean that they will gain something incredible for their own populations, especially if they're a democratic state where people care a lot about prosperousness and can enforce their demands onto their leaders. The second school of thought is liberal institutionalism, also known as just like liberalism. There were a couple of foundational assumptions of it. The first is economic interdependence. States that trade with each other tend to develop common interests because I am much less likely to hurt another state if my own economy will suffer massively as a result of doing so. And so the basic idea here is that if states have traded more and prospered more, they will just fight a lot less. The second thing is iterated interactions. And this is maybe the most important thing to draw from the lecture, which is to say, states interact with each other in games, basically. You can think about it each as like prisoner's dilemmas or stag hunts or whatever payoff structure that tends to govern that particular interaction. Which is also to say that states can cooperate with each other or defect from each other and betray each other, etc. And if these are one-off interactions, and the fact that I mistrust the other state and the fact that I don't think they're going to act in my best interest, in fact, we don't have common interests at all, means that I'm going to act in the way that most obviously promotes myself, which is often going to be to defect or to not cooperate because I don't trust the other state. If you do these interactions over a very long period of time, that you do a lot of them, you can work out strategies and you can work out compromise with the other state that allows both of you to gain. You can implement things like one strategy is called the dead man's trigger, which is basically like, I say to you, if you ever defect on a single one of these games, I will not cooperate ever again. And I have to follow through with that, obviously, to be credible. But it is an effective strategy to prevent defection because the actual gains from the other state betraying you that once are far outweighed by the loss of your cooperation in every future interaction. And so the fact that the specter of the future basically allows you to work out compromises or work out arrangements that in some way mitigate the issue of mistrust. And that might not seem like it applies to IR, but here's how it does, right? Like if I betray another state in a trade agreement, the other state doesn't make agreements with me anymore, and they tell other states don't make agreements with them anymore, they betrayed me. And then I gained from that agreement, but I've lost the potential of every other agreement that could exist. And so the fact that there's so many interactions that are constantly happening between states allows states to, I mean, it's not like, Xi and Trump go up to the drawing board and they write up their X's and their Y's for the game, but certainly it allows states to act in ways that can keep each other's interests in mind and advance both of them mutually without forfeiting any of their own security or power. So the outputs obviously are cooperation is much more possible than it is under a realist view. States pursue absolute gains a lot of the time because they share interests with other states, or at the very least aren't particularly threatened by the extra gain of a different state. Institutions are likely to be quite durable because states become more intertwined as a process of joining these institutions. And so if they advance their own interests through the institution, they're likely to commit to it even further. And democracies will just not fight each other. This is sort of a separate finding, to be honest, but it is also a part of liberal institutionalism. But this is one of the strongest findings in IR, which is that democracies really do not tend to go to war with each other. And the reasons why are actually not terribly clear. There's a lot of different theories. But probably one of the most credible ones is that democracies serve as strong intention signalers. If it is the case that a leader gets elected on a certain platform, as I said before, they're much more likely to at least not explicitly and exclusively betray that platform from a foreign policy perspective. And if they do so, they will be held to account by their own publics. And so there is, I think, a lot to be said for the fact that democracies as a signaling mechanism allows for states to not have to go to war because they can kind of figure out what each other are doing. What are the weaknesses of liberal institutionalism? Firstly, is that institutions were strong, but they're starting to decline in strength, which is a bit of a problem because even if they can nominally exist, if institutions don't actually do anything, it's a bit unclear how much they actually add as a theoretical advance or a feature of the world. Secondly, that security competition has intensified a lot over the past 10 years or so. Certainly, there was a moment from the early 90s to the mid 2010s where the US was pretty much unipolar, and that's not true anymore. China and the US, despite being incredibly economically interdependent, have extensive security competition, which suggests that merely trading, even if it's a lot of trade, it doesn't solve root problems and doesn't make it so that states can just basically sing kumbaya around a campfire. And lastly is that institutions don't have coercive power except for that which states give them, i.e., the only coercive power that things like NATO or the ICC, etc., have is things that states volunteer to those organizations. And often those coercive powers are quite weak. And so it's a little bit unclear whether institutions actually mean anything, whether it's just a projection of state power by a different name. The last thing is constructivism. So I'll be honest, I'm not a constructivist, and I'm not terribly good at explaining it. But the basic idea of constructivism is that ideas, norms, and identities matter beyond just power, beyond just calculation, beyond just rationality. That is, that states place certain premiums on narratives and ideas that go beyond that idea in and of itself, if that makes sense. And I'll try to give an example of this. One of the foundational assumptions of realism, obviously, is anarchy, which is every state is sort of in it for themselves. There's no third party to oversee the system. And perhaps the most famous article in constructivism, or at the very least one that launched constructivism as a serious IR academic movement, was anarchy is what states make of it. It argues that anarchy exists. It is true. There is objectively no third party overseeing the international system. But that doesn't logically lead to security competition. If it does, it is because states have made certain normative assumptions about what anarchy means. And that is sort of where constructivism plays in, which is interrogating why and what power do these kinds of assumptions have and why do they get made, basically. So a brief drill. What is probably best is that I'll say the drill, you pause, think of your answers, and then I'll talk about it as I would approach it, but there's no real right answer. A motion would be time space 2001. This House was the US, would not let China into the WTO. So from a realist lens, you could say, well, China will gain a lot from going into the WTO. Maybe they'll gain more than the US, maybe because they're poorer, maybe because they have less markets to begin with, maybe because they'll cheat more. I don't know. And this means that it's not in the US's interest, because even if the US gains a lot from Chinese trade, if China gains more from trading with the US, then I have lost from a relative gains perspective. And the translation of that basically is like, well, China will gain more from it than I will, and so China will have extra power that they can use potentially to undermine my own goals. Secondly, is a liberal institutionalist lens. This would probably say, well, it would be a good idea to let them in because we would trade a lot more with them. And this would, one, make security competition considerably less likely because we would have more common interests. And two, we'd be far more able to set up durable arrangements that can actually make sure we cooperate with each other. Constructivism is probably the hardest lens to approach it from. But one way you could think about it is like, what ideas do states associate with joining international organizations or not joining them? If China is constantly branded with the idea of being a rogue state because it's not allowed to join the WTO, what does that idea have? What impact does that idea have on how China acts? That kind of ideational argument is often difficult to make at APDA, but nonetheless does have a certain weight to it. So I'll talk then about a few concepts in IR and in politics that I think are important to know for debate. The first is the nuclear revolution. Basically, everything about IR changed when nuclear weapons were introduced. The big debate in IR, at least for the second half of the 20th century, was the debate between mutually assured destruction and the stability and stability paradox. Mutually assured destruction is basically the argument that if states both have second-strike capabilities, they both have the ability to hit each other even after having been hit by a nuclear weapon, they will not go into conflict because they know the risk is too great for them to bear, even if they might win. The stability and stability paradox is that if both states have nuclear weapons, but both states know that nuclear weapon usage is super, super devastating and super, super awful, they're often just fine with fighting each other below that threshold for which it would go nuclear. And there are examples of each argument. I think that both of them are true in different settings. So the Cold War never having a nuclear, explosion as a result, it's really a pretty compelling argument for mutually assured destruction. But an example of the latter is the Kargil War, where India and Pakistan, despite both being nuclear armed, went into a moderately bloody war in the late 1990s, I think it was, because they both knew that even if they fought, they would just keep it to a low enough threshold that the risk of nuclear weapons is not a credible threat from either of them. So the question then is, why haven't they gotten used? Why haven't nuclear weapons gotten used? There's been plausibly a lot of situations where they could have been used, surprisingly enough. There was debates about whether we would use it in Vietnam, whether we'd use it in Korea. I think the Soviet Union probably debated at different times as well. But they haven't, at least not since World War II. And there's explanations from each school of thought. The real explanation is it's just not a good or advance of your own security. If you do that, you lead to other states bandwagoning against you, or rather balancing against you. You make other states more likely to fear for their own security and thus acquire their own nuclear weapon, etc. But there are arguments to be made that it's just worsens your security, so it was just never a good bet to do it. There's an institutionalist argument that it's like the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and a bunch of other things that we set out in the world made it so we could basically prevent it through these institutions. And the constructivist argument, surprisingly, at this point, I think is actually just quite compelling, which is that there's just been a taboo associated with the idea of nuclear use that has meant that even in situations where institutions wouldn't have mattered, even in situations where usage might have been strategic, there was enough of a taboo associated with the usage of nuclear weapons that we chose not to use them. And there's actually an excellent book on this question specifically. The second concept I want to talk about is intervention, because this comes up a lot in APDA. I think the sort of general view of intervention is APDA is quite pessimistic, which is that interventions never work. They do sometimes work. They often don't for reasons that are pretty obvious, but I think it's actually better to talk about the reasons why they might work. The first is that there's deterrence. So even if interventions don't work perfectly, there's still quite a bit of a headache for the state being intervened into. And so there's a pretty compelling argument that interventions generally existing is a good thing because it makes states more likely to rein in bad behavior. There is a converse to this, and it's quite an interesting argument that I don't think most people really read in debate, which is to say that if intervention is something that happens rather frequently, it is more likely that groups that want a government to be overthrown will start an armed conflict so that the government will then repress them and therefore lead to international intervention. And this argument sounds insane, but there is at least some evidence for it having happened in Kosovo in 1999. So there is a thought there, but that's mostly just like an academic interest, not something super important. The second thing to be said for interventions is that if they limit their missions and are specifically considering particular things as being their objective rather than having huge creep as to what they consider a success, they can be quite effective at accomplishing narrower goals. So the US and Afghanistan, by a lot of counts, did not work. But we did a pretty good job, actually, of targeting al-Qaeda, at least for the first few years. Then, obviously, we got involved in trying to set up a functional Afghan government, and that didn't work quite as well. But it is worth noting that interventions, if they are narrowly targeted at particular objectives, can get those goals done, especially if those objectives are largely military in nature as opposed to being political, because political objectives often have a lot more time frame needed for them, and the more time you're into the intervention, the more things that can go wrong, and the more your domestic public will want you to get out of it. There are several problems with intervention beyond the very obvious ones of you're starting a war in a different country. One of them is that they create perverse incentives in certain situations. So one way you can get interveners out of your country, either peacekeepers or foreign militaries, is to create as many casualties as possible because they'll be more likely to pull out as a result. The second is mistrust. Beyond just a general mistrust of the international system, if someone invades my country and kills a bunch of my people, I am just very unlikely to ever take them at their word. And so the possibility to build longer-term durable institutions in a country through intervention is quite curtailed. What has a mixed record in intervention or pseudo intervention sort of debates? I would say two things that are worth noting. One is population-centric strategies. This means instances in which you are trying to persuade a population of your side of the intervention. So this is what we did, or we at least sort of tried to do it, at least in Iraq, which is obviously there were a bunch of civilian casualties, which were very bad, but we would nominally create infrastructure projects in a variety of ways to persuade Iraqi civilians to side with us as opposed to the other government. And the logic underpinning this is not wrong in the sense that civilians matter a lot, and if states alienate civilians, they are very likely to inform on them. If civilians will join the insurgents or give information about the intervener to the insurgents, or just make life just generally a lot harder. The problem is that even if you try these things, they don't necessarily work, both because they get hijacked by the other party, by the insurgent, because civilians still don't trust you, even if you build a pipe in their village or whatever. Um, there is a mixed record here. It can work, it can also not work, but it's certainly worth debating. The other is leadership decapitation, which is the targeting of specific leaders within especially insurgent or terrorist organizations. It depends on the organization. The basic finding from political science literature is that the more institutionalized an organization is, like the more set up it has, the more chain of command it has, the less impact a decapitation is likely to have. If, on the other hand, an organization is very, very much so disorganized or loose, decapitation can have a very big effect. There isn't an auxiliary question of whether having a big effect is good or bad, because that big effect can be the organization doesn't work anymore, or it can be the organization splits into 5 different organizations which fight with each other and with you, which just increases violence. And there's not like a clear distinction of what causes one or the other, but often it comes down to whether one leader is like a super clear spiritual or messianic or political leader for a movement. There's not really a clear substitute, or if there are just a lot of different factions which they could easily splinter off into. The next, which I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, was insurgency and political violence. So what tends to really matter in explaining insurgency and political violence? 3 things. One is state capacity. Strong states do not have insurgencies. Weak states do. If you're a strong state, you can very easily deal with an insurgency through non-military means, but you can also deal with it through military means, just quash it very early on. It's only really weak states that have this issue. Like, systematically, the finding is quite strong on this question. Secondly is terrain. There have been a variety of findings that have said that basically mountainous terrain or difficult to access terrain is fertile ground for insurgencies because governments find it a lot harder to repress them when they're in those kinds of areas. Thirdly is lootable resources. This is sort of slightly more unintuitive, but the basic argument here is that insurgencies have a huge bed of easily lootable resources like gold, etc., to make money from. They find it a lot easier to operate because they don't have to tax civilians or work themselves to death to do so. And there is also an interesting implication on how insurgencies operate differently when they do and don't have lootable resources. Weinstein basically argues in his book, I think it's Inside Rebellion, that insurgencies with huge amounts of lootable resources are very disorganized and very violent because a lot of people join the insurgency who are just in it basically for the money. And because top down, the insurgency can enforce much discipline on its members as a result. Whereas insurgencies that don't have that sort of structure, that actually do have to make their own money from taxing civilians or setting up good governance structures, have to behave a lot better, both because, one, the people who they're attracted to be true believers who are not going to act in ways that are contrary to the movement, but two, because in order to get money, they have to tax civilians. And if you murder a bunch of civilians all the time, civilians don't produce anymore for you to tax from in the first place. What doesn't matter as much as people think it does? One is ethnicity. Ethnicity can matter, for sure. Ethnicity absolutely does matter in a lot of settings, but it matters contextually depending on how politics affects ethnicity. And one of the most elegant examples of what I mean by this is that there's this argument from, I think it's Daniel Posner, talking about Chiwas and Tumbukas, which are 2 ethnic groups. And there's Chiwas and Tumbukas in Malawi, and there's Chiwas and Tumbukas in Zambia. But there are a much larger fraction of the population in Malawi than they are in Zambia. And so the basic argument Posner points out is, in Malawi, because these 2 ethnicities are both large enough to be important political blocs, they're incredibly competitive with each other. In Zambia, when they're both too small to be a bloc on their own, they actually cooperate quite well and have very strong intergroup relations. And there's not an intrinsic difference in how they exist across the borders. It is just a question of the political environment in each state is different and changes the attachments people have to ethnicity. That, I think, is an interesting sort of point that can kind of illustrate why a lot of the arguments enacted about like, well, they're different ethnicities, so they are just bound to fight, don't usually work. The second is individual level poverty. One of the most popular explanations of political violence is desperation. There's just a very simple opportunity cost logic to it. It's just, if I don't have a job in the first place, I'm not worried about losing my job if I go to war. I'm more desperate. I have more grievances, etc. Actually, findings have pretty universally pointed out that terrorists and insurgents are often wealthier than the rest of the population they're from. Now, they still come from comparatively disadvantaged societies a lot of the time, though not all of the time. But there is, I think, a lot to be said for the idea that individuals' choice to go to war or to rebel or to commit acts of violence against civilians has not that much to do with their own individual economic circumstances. It's far more to do with ideology or with general attachments to a sort of project. And that's not always predictable by things like poverty or neat opportunity cost logic. The next concept I want to talk about is just some basic theory of autocratic regimes, which take up a large portion of the world's population. So how do autocratic regimes keep power? It's neither because they need all the people to stop revolutions. It is also not that they have like one elite who they care about and don't have to be accountable to anyone else. It is obviously more nuanced than that. So how do autocratic regimes tend to keep power? The basic theory that is popular these days is selectorate theory. Selectorate theory basically holds that there is a selectorate, which is a group of people who can determine the person who is in power, and a winning coalition, which is the bare minimum amount of people you need to keep power. And these are different, and the size of each of them is incredibly important. So if you have a very, very small winning coalition, i.e. if you only need a very, very, very small amount of elites to be able to keep power, the kinds of goods I'm going to produce as an autocrat are far more likely to be private goods that are accrued to those people specifically. Because if I don't care about anyone else, I don't need them to be able to keep power, it doesn't matter to me. So the winning coalition being very small compared to the selectorate means autocrats produce more private than public goods. If, on the other hand, the selectorate is much larger, i.e. there's a lot of people from whom I can pick people in the winning coalition, then the members of the winning coalition are more easily replaced. So what do I mean by that? If there's a ton of potential elites who could decide who stays in power, but only 2 or 3 of them are actually needed for me to keep power, if any given elite in the winning coalition wants to side against me, I can replace him. I've got tons of other ones in this electorate to replace him with. And so there is a reason why, if there's a large enough electorate, the members of the winning coalition have to compromise with the autocrat a lot of the time, because otherwise they just find themselves might be replaced. So this sort of theory is not like explains any particular state type thing, but it is a way of thinking about states, i.e. how much of the general population or how much of the class of elites is actually needed for a dictator to maintain power, and how does that influence the kinds of goods and the kinds of policies the dictator is likely to pursue as a result. So how do autocrats lose power? I think in a lot of rounds, people assume that it's either inevitable or never going to happen, and the truth is usually somewhere in between. I think the most interesting thing about how autocrats lose power is a phenomenon called now out of never or preference falsification, which basically says that in a situation where there can be situations where basically no one is rebelling against the regime, and then the regime is overthrown incredibly quickly, in a matter of weeks by huge popular outcry. And the question is, why does that happen? And the answer is, every individual's decision to protest against the regime is influenced both by how much they dislike the regime, but also by how threatened they are when they choose to protest. But here's the thing. That second function of how much they're threatened by their choice to protest is influenced by how many other people are protesting at a given time. Because there's strength in numbers, because the probability of success goes up as each individual person joins, etc. So consider the situation. There's 1 million people in this country, and all of them really hate the government, but none of them want to be the first person to rebel. Then 10 people decide, I am going to be the one to stand up. I am tired of this government. They did one thing too many. I'm willing to rebel. So then they start protesting. Now, the people who have the lowest threshold at which they will start rebelling will join with them, because now there are enough other people protesting that they're willing to join in. And there's a very easy snowball effect here, as each individual person's threshold to go protest is more likely to be met with each other person that joins the protest in the first place. And this is why the Eastern Bloc crumbled so quickly. It's not because people changed their minds about the regimes, but it's because when people saw that enough other people were out there protesting, they were always anti-regime in a lot of situations, but only then did they feel comfortable joining into those protests. The second thing is coups. Authoritarian governments lose power to coups all the time. The pretty easy reason why is because militaries are tricky to deal with. If you don't fund them enough, they get upset and they want to coup you. They have the guns in the country. And if you fund them too much, they get thrown ambitions about how to run the country and they coup you as a result. So there's always a little bit of a delicate balancing game with authoritarian regimes and militaries. So what do authoritarians often do as a response? They coup-proof. They set up parallel security institutions that are accountable to themselves, which they use to check the military. So Saddam Hussein was maybe the biggest exponent of coup-proofing. He set up his own security forces, which basically were not accountable to the military whatsoever, were exclusively accountable to himself, and operated entirely in parallel as a means to check the military. And this kind of strategy allows you, it does degrade your military capabilities very strongly, but it also allows you to keep power and you otherwise wouldn't be able to. That section of the lecture is just talking and debating about politics. So I would say the most important thing you can do is to think about incentives. Most cases do not change incentives. They just change actions or policies, and the incentives usually stay the same. And so the question of the debate is usually about manifestations. And most of the time, people miss this, and it is incredibly important. So what are some basic ways that things manifest differently? They can manifest under the table as opposed to over the table. They can manifest at different government levels, like done by local government instead of national government. They can be manifested by other actors filling in for a need, like a private company or a third-party actor, etc. That's by no means an exhaustive list, but it is a conceptual approach to debating about politics that I think can be quite helpful. So there's 3 examples down there. I will go through each of them. So the first is the US should stop selling high precision bombs to Saudi Arabia. So you should probably pause, by the way, and think of the answer to these things, and then I'll talk about them. There's 2 ways of going about this that talk about manifestations. One of which is if we don't sell it to Saudi Arabia, then Russia or China will, and that's worse. The other of which is if we don't sell them to Saudi Arabia, we're going to sell them to somewhere else, and that's worse. But in both cases, you're not contesting the idea that either Saudi Arabia wants to buy bombs or the US wants to sell bombs. Those things don't get changed by the motion. So how do you debate about how those things might change? And so comparing it to that actual comparative, rather than just imagining that by implementing this policy, then the entire incentive calculus of every actor ever shifts, tends to be a much better way of debating IR. Secondly is, this prefers a world in which no developing countries took loans from the IMF. So what do they do if they don't take loans from the IMF? Maybe they take loans from China. That seems like it could go worse. It could go better, whatever. Maybe they take loans from private creditors, which would charge higher interest rates, maybe also wouldn't mandate as many things of like structural adjustment, etc. All of these are questions that are like, not is the IMF blanket good, bad, but is the IMF better than what the same actors would do in other circumstances? There's also maybe a different argument of like, well, if the IMF wasn't around, there would still be a demand for Western countries to try to provide financing to developing countries. And so maybe they'd form a different institution that was more lenient than the IMF. Maybe those incentives also don't change. And so there's actually a benefit from doing so. But either way, it's just about thinking in these terms. Last is, this believes the Rwandan government shouldn't have invaded the Congo in 1996. You don't need to know much specifics about this, but the very basic thing you can assume here is, well, they probably had a reason to do so, and if the government doesn't do so, maybe militias would have done so in the counterfactual, or maybe a different state would have done so in the counterfactual. So thinking about things as not, well, if X thing happens, then that's just it, but rather, how do other actors fill the need for X thing, and how does the difference between the X thing in the first instance and the X thing in the second instance, how does that define the debate? The next thing I'll say is that politics is usually about more links than impacts. The reason why is pretty trivial. Every impact causes every other impact in IR. Recession can cause war, which can cause political instability, which can cause war, which can cause recession, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of weighing can just pretty easily be done through this kind of lens. And so what tends to matter more is setting up a diversification, i.e. a lot of different paths to offense. So like not just contingent on one view of the world or one actor acting in one way, but a bunch of different ways of being able to get your offense. And secondly is utilizing less contested paths. If it's like not terribly apparent which impact matters the most, a lot of effective weighing can just be done with like, look, you have a 100% certainty that this thing is happening now and that it's really awful and you should do something to stop it. This thing will cause all of their impacts too, so there's no reason to vote for them, even if you think the arguments are true, etc. And so framing your arguments in terms of uniqueness and conceded links, rather than focusing a ton on trying to like weigh easily weighable things against each other, knowing that your opponent's going to do the same thing in the next speech, tends to be, I think, a slightly better approach. Okay. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions. I know I went through this a bit fast and everything, but I hope it made sense and was at least somewhat helpful. I hope to see you at Summer Open.